Belonging to Blackness with your host, Yndia Wilmot.
Who lived in Brooklyn?
Season 5. So welcome, Tessa.
Thank you so much for having me.
In my introduction, I mentioned the term colored as one that holds several meanings depending on the geopolitical context. Colored as an ethnicity and a racial demographic is intertwined in the creation of the South Africa that I think we know and understand today. Yet often colored communities are disdained as people with no clear heritage or culture, like not being Black enough or white enough.
That phrase, not Black enough, not white enough, is a really important one for me in this conversation. Because what that phrase has done, and even the use in colored communities of that phrase, has been extremely limiting for our understanding of what coloredness is, right? It makes it seem that colored is a race in a very kind of static biological way. That when you see a colored person, you're thinking, where's the white and where's the Black? But as we know, number one, race is not a real thing in so many ways, especially biologically. The thing that we must understand about not Black and not white is that Black and white are these deeply, deeply historical concepts themselves. You know, what it means to be white and what it means to be Black is about this long-standing racial war that white supremacy has brought on the world to create a better and worse category of person. And that's actually why I think the colored question and question of colored identity is so important. When I think about the history, the easiest way to explain it is that coloredness emerges in South Africa at three important moments. One is that it's a product of slavery. South Africans very seldom talk about the slave trade and slave moment in our country, but it was a huge part of the colonial project. Enslaved people from Malaysia, Indonesia, enslaved people from Ghana, from Mozambique, from Angola, and up and down the East Coast, particularly of the continent, Malagasy, and then also enslaved Indian people, indentured Indians were brought by particularly British colonial settlers. And so you had the Dutch colony in the Cape that predominantly had kind of Malay and East African slaves. And then you had enslaved people from India that came with the British. And so those two groupings of colonial enslaved people, and now formerly enslaved people, their descendants, weren't seen as native, of course, to the continent. They weren't seen as native to the land. And so giving them a name that identified them as different was one of the first acts of the creation of coloredness, a separating out. And we all know that one of white supremacy's great tasks is divide and rule. And so coloredness was always this way to divide up. And so particularly Cecil John Rhodes was one of the earliest people to use the word colored. Post-slavery in the Cape, he was looking for a group of people that were easily exploited for the gold and diamond fields. And so he made a calculation that the formerly enslaved, because they weren't native to the continent and their numbers were smaller, were probably easier to exploit than native groups of people, and used the word colored as a way to categorize who those people were. And so even that origin story tells you that the creation of colored as an idea was a way to divide and rule, a way to figure out who is more or less worthy of being human, who's more or less easy to exploit. And that's part of the history of the word colored. The second part of that is, of course, just the colonial project and the colonial settler project in South Africa itself, which lends itself to racial mixing. And so whether that's enslaved people and their slave masters, whether through, violence of rape or love, whether it's the mixing of enslaved people and indigenous people, but there's this kind of mixing that happens between people. And the children born of those mixed relations, again, what was the naming convention for those children? Especially in a context where, again, the colonial setting was one about keeping people apart from each other and not allowing Black people to build power. I particularly in the book speak a lot about Black mothers and the ways in which mixed children became a threat to white supremacy in a way that made their mothers need to be shameful, hide their children. There was all of this ambiguity about mixed children that we see all the way to now. I tell the story of Trevor Noah, and why it's so fitting that his book is called Born a Crime. Because, besides the fact that we argue that Trevor Noah is not colored, which I'll get to later, his presence did signify that Black women were desirable to white men. And Black women were human, and their humanity matters if you see that they have children with white men. And that's one of the things that white supremacy was always afraid of, that mixed children represented. They represented, in some ways, the humanity of Black people. And just disappearing Black women and taking on lighter-skinned mixed children and embracing them in white communities, I think is also one of those, harms that the creation of colored identity has done during the colonial period. But the last, and probably for our purposes, when we think about colored identity today, a moment of coloredness as a classification is the apartheid classification moment that happens, right around 1950. And so with all of this history of the word colored kind of floating around generally in society as a way to divide up Black people for various reasons, at the apartheid moment, it becomes quite technical, legal, and insidious. Because what the Afrikaner government does, the apartheid government does, is creates 4 categories of race. And I always like to say to people, when I say these categories, at least 3 of the 4, no one would actually consider a race at all, right? But they create these 4 categories of race, which is white, Asian, colored, native. And in that order, each of these groups are given a stratified sense of privilege. So with white people with the highest level of privilege, Asian people with secondary levels of privilege, colored people with slightly less privilege than Asian people, and native or Black people with the least privilege. And that stratification for white people was, of course, clearly important to make sure that they were classified with the most privilege in a society where they were a minority and wanted to rule and get resources. But for colored people particularly, there was a classification act that said you had to go to a classification office and be classified. And I come to learning about this in a very tangible way through my father's story that I tell in the book. So my father grew up in kind of a central part of the country, which is now known as the Northwest. And he grew up as a Motswana boy for all intents and purposes. And so Motswana is one of our indigenous Black cultural groups. And my father is from a family that has mixed heritage because there's a German grandfather that came during one of the wars and married a Motswana woman. So the family kind of has, all of these different looks and origins and all of that. But when my father goes to be classified, he's with none of his elders. Nobody in the family knows he was being classified that day. I call it the perverse school trip, where you take children from school and take them to a classification office. Wow. As if it's no big deal, But as a 16-year-old, he arrives there and he presents himself. My father's a dark-skinned man. He spoke Setswana. He had a Setswana name, Lesole. And so he just presents as he knows himself, right? And he gets classified as native. When he goes home, he discovers, as many colored families did, that our family had chosen to classify as colored, which meant that the way they would present at a classification office would denote things that would make them colored. And that means also already at that point, even the apartheid government knew it wasn't about black and white in terms of physical appearance, because otherwise it would just be, you walk in, you look at somebody's body and you decide. But they would ask these questions as these clerks about what language you speak, what gestures you use, what your parents' origins are. They would ask all of these questions because there was cultural layers that they were looking for as markers, because they realized it wasn't as easy as just looking at people's biology. And so by deciding to classify as colored, they then would make determinations about how they would answer questions to ensure that they would classify as colored rather than native. And that's opting into a privilege that the apartheid government was affording colored communities. And that's a really important distinction that I'll get back to later as well. The downside of that, because you're opting into a privilege, was the violence that came with that classification. And my father experienced that violence very clearly in that moment, because a few days later, he gets taken back to the classification office, has to present speaking Afrikaans, and has to present with an English name, Elliot, and then gets reclassified. And so common was reclassification, especially of colored people, that the apartheid government actually had a slot on radio stations every Friday to announce reclassifications. The horror of it was that my father lost his identity that day. He lost his language because he was not allowed to speak his language anymore. He lost his name. My father was 79 years old when I first found out that his name was Lisole,
Wow.
because I'd grown up with him as Elliot. But because the system was forcing these cultural choices, my father lost identity. And later on, the system would also then create the Group Areas Act that creates colored communities geographically as we know them today, because you weren't allowed to live and interact with people who were not of your same classification. So in your family, as it was in the case with my father, if his siblings, and one of his siblings classified as native Black and he classified as colored, they weren't allowed to live in the same space. They weren't allowed to inhabit the same places. He was actually arrested for working at his aunt's shop because she had a shop in a native area or in a Black area. And so there was a violence that came with that I don't think we speak about enough. And so colored communities as we know them now are this violent invention, really, of a classification moment, of a Group Areas Act that forced people away from their families, away from their land, away from their cultures, into these new communities with disparate groups of people, and then said to them, now you must show us that you are real people that can create real lives and real culture, even though you are born of this moment of violence. And so when I say colored, I'm talking about those communities particularly, because those are the communities that represent the culture for me today, or that grouping for me today.